without realizing that people couldn't hear me. So it really is a pleasure, and it's always a pleasure to be with fellow Laurentians. And I really wish that we could all be together. And maybe my first comment I'd make is I really hope and pray that all of you and your families and friends are safe and healthy during this really, really crazy period. And hopefully we get through all this. So thinking about everybody. And this whole concept of having programs like this, I think is great. What I would love to do is make this as open as possible. And again, I know we can't be together, but I really would encourage you to just type in any questions that you'd like. And I told Shana just to interrupt me as I was going. So rather than this being a monologue, we could turn into a little bit more of a dialogue. And for that reason, there are no PowerPoint slides. If I see these PowerPoint slides, it kind of drives me crazy. So what I'm going to do is talk a little bit about this book, Year 168. And the thought process was I had the opportunity to teach at Northwestern at the Kellogg School. And when I first started teaching, I really focused on all about leadership, right? So how do you become a leader? How do you become a better leader? And that's what I was teaching. And about a year ago, one of the students said, all right, well, that's how you become a better leader. But I think a bigger question for some of us is, how do you lead a value-based life? And I thought, well, that's an interesting question. So I developed a class for this, and this book is sort of a summary. And what I'd love to do is just summarize a couple of these thoughts. I'll try to keep it relatively short so you folks can jump in. I told Shana I could do a 3-hour lecture on this, but I think I'd bore people pretty quickly. But here was sort of the concept. If I think about all of us that are on this call, the one thing that's pretty clear is, if we're honest about it, most of us have at least 2 or 3 times the number of things we'd like to do than we're ever going to get done. I don't mean to disappoint people on a Friday, but if you think about your career, your family, maybe your spirituality, your health, a little bit of sleep occasionally, a little exercise, a little fun. I think for some of us realizing we really are here for a blink of an eye, maybe we make a difference in the world. There's just a lot to do. And when we got a lot to do, being pretty conscientious, often we say, well, we'll just keep going faster and faster. This is where all the multitasking kicks in, right? And of course, we've got all these great devices, Blackberries, Blueberries, iPhones, iPads. We can just go faster and faster. And I think the real key thing to do is take the time, and this is a question I ask executives all the time, or students, have we confused activity and productivity? We're very active. It's amazing how active we are, right? We're in a meeting that's supposed to go for an hour. It ends 15 minutes early. Oh, I have 15 minutes. I can go through, 20 emails, 40 texts, maybe a couple of Snapchats, whatever that is. We're in motion. And when I was starting to think about this, I actually decided to call the book Your 168. And I was doing a presentation for one company, and the CEO said, well, what's 168? I don't understand what that number is. And of course, being a math major from Lawrence, I said to the guy, well, when you've got a really bad week, I mean a really bad week, how hard are you working? And he said, well, it's 24/7. And I said, well, maybe only math people do this, but multiply 24 times 7, carry the 2, you usually get 168. And the whole thought process for me is every single one of us, on this call, you got 168 hours. That's what you got. And I think the real question is, how do you spend those 168? And do you even know where you're spending them? And so this whole thought process of thinking about how you do this, and again, I try to keep this very simple because I realize if I make it complicated, I confuse myself. So a little bit of the simplicity of this for me is if I ran into somebody like Shana and I said, hey, Shana, do you want to have lunch today? Well, often she may say, well, I don't have the time. And I'm always trying to remind you do have the time. You got 168 hours, but really, is it a priority? Is it really a priority? And I think over time, what I've realized is that one of the very first things I believe to do, if you really want to think about this, is to take a little bit of time to self-reflect. Now, when I say self-reflect, what I mean, rather than all the craziness that goes on, take a short amount of time, not a lot, get off by yourself, turn off all the gadgets, and ask yourself what I think are some pretty important questions. Questions like the following. What are my values? What's my purpose? No kidding around. What really matters? What kind of a leader do I want to be? In my role, in my family, whatever. What kind of example do I want to set? for others. And taking a little bit of time to think about that helps me separate out activity and productivity. It actually helps me start to prioritize. Now, if you're like most folks I talk to, the usual reaction is, well, Harry, that sounds great, but I just don't have the time. And I'm always asking myself, is it we don't have the time, or very seriously, is this something we really don't want to do? Because this could be a little sensitive, right? There could be a pretty big difference between what we say is important and what we're actually doing. We may not want to go there, right? But when we say we don't have the time, interesting, some of us actually try to exercise every day. Some of you may have gotten up this morning, prayed, done some meditation. And a lot of people, once in a while, have to commute someplace. Not as much now, given all the insanity. But is it we don't have the time, or is it something we really don't want to do? And I think taking a little bit of time with this helps in a very, very significant way, because then you're actually taking the time to realize what am I doing and what am I not doing. And by the way, if you ask yourself this self-reflection, a lot of times students will say, well, can you give me an example? And I often say that I have very, very few answers, but I got a lot of opinions. So I usually tell groups, I don't do Q&A, I do a lot of Q&O. So when Shana asks some questions later, it's not Q&A, it really is Q&A. They're opinions. And when I think about the reaction sometimes that people have to this process is, have they really thought about what they're really doing? And it turns out when somebody says, well, how do you know whether somebody's self-reflective? This may be a surprise, but anybody on this call can determine whether somebody else is self-reflective by talking to them for about 10 minutes. That's really all it takes. Because if you're not self-reflective, you're constantly surprised, and other people are wondering, why are you surprised? So a good example, I'll be out at O'Hare Airport in Chicago. I'll run into a former student, and I'll say, hey, Charlie, how you doing? Well, Professor Kraemer, no, Harry, well, I'm just really surprised. I said, well, Charlie, what are you surprised by? Well, I now have 2 young boys. I have no relationship with my 2 boys. I'm just really surprised. Well, Charlie, do you spend time with your 2 boys? No, I don't spend any time at all. But yet you're surprised. And I say to myself, I'm surprised you're surprised. Because interestingly enough, if you're self-reflective, there's not that many reasons to be surprised, right? I mean, all of us on this call, sometime in our career, we didn't get the job we wanted, we didn't get the promotion we wanted, or somebody we care deeply about, passes away and dies. It's very unfortunate, but it really shouldn't be a surprise. In fact, any of you can kind of think about this now, even over the weekend. Somebody, I guarantee you, in the next 2 days will say to you, for some reason, I'm very surprised. And you should just ask them, why are you surprised? When they tell you you're surprised, I think you're going to ask yourself, I'm sort of surprised you're surprised. So this whole idea of thinking about where you spend your time and why. Now, one of the areas that I find very, very interesting is often people will come up to me, and maybe somebody have done this to you, and they'll say, I'm really having trouble balancing my life. I'm really having trouble balancing my life. I got a lot going on. And what I realize is an awful lot of people, my opinion, that are having trouble balancing their life have not been self-reflective enough to figure out what they're trying to balance. See, because if you haven't been self-reflective, how do you know what's important? What is, and by the way, it's going to be different for every single person. And what I try to get people to do is to say, all right, what really is important? And I'm going to believe, if I saw all of you on the screen, I'd ask you the question to see you have a hand raised. How many of you have heard this expression, and it seems to be all over the place, called work-life balance? Work-life balance. Now, at least for me, that turns out to be one of the most confusing statements I can think about, because if I think about it slowly, work-life balance, it sounds like you're either working or you're living. Now, some of us are working enough. If that's not living, that could be a problem. So about 20 some years ago, I decided when I was running Baxter, I'm not going to talk about work-life balance anymore. I'm going to talk about life balance, because most people I know are trying to balance their life. Now, when you say you're going to balance your life, what does that really mean? So what I did in writing the book is I interviewed several hundred people, and I just simply asked the question, young people, intermediate, older people, different parts of the world, what's life balance mean to you? And it was very interesting. Everybody I talked to eventually would talk about buckets. Well, there's 3 major buckets I'm focused on, or 5 or 10. There was an amazing normal distribution around 6. And what I mean by that is most people, when they think about what they're trying to balance in their life, can group things into 6 topics. Now, some people don't use all 6. That's fine. Some people may have a few more, but usually around 6. And here they are in a particular order, okay? One bucket is for your career, your education, either at Lawrence, post-Lawrence, or whatever, your jobs. A second one is your family, your friends, okay, colleagues. A third bucket for some people is your spirituality, whatever your religious perspectives happen to be. A fourth bucket is your health. You can throw in exercise, a little sleep into that bucket. A fifth one, I'll just call it fun, enjoyment, doing something, going to the ball game, playing golf or the movies or whatever. And then the sixth bucket for some people refer to it as being socially responsible. I call it basically being a best citizen, making a difference in the world. Now, if you think of those 6 buckets, career, family, spirituality, health, fun, making a difference, the exercise I try to get people to do is to ask themselves, what would your goal be? In a perfect world, what would your goal be on each of those 6? Now, there's an exercise here. You can do, but here's what I would say. Only attempt this exercise. Only attempt this exercise when you're in a really good mood. And the reason for that is there could be a pretty big difference between what your goal is and what you're actually doing. So here's the exercise if you don't get a chance to look at the book. The first column is your goal. So what percentage of your time as a goal would you want on those elements of your life? The second column is current reality. Now, the third column is the difference, right? Now, I've yet to meet the person who says, boy, my goal lined up perfectly with where I'm spending my time. I have not met that person yet. Now, there's going to be a difference. If there's a huge difference, then you have to ask yourself, well, is it because I said that was important, but it really isn't? Or you know what? It really is, but I'm just not disciplined enough. And by the way, when you think about this, you think about those 6 buckets, and you're looking at the percentage of the time. I often tease people, the sum of those percentages, by the way, do not exceed 100%. And some people say, well, that's obvious. I mean, obviously, I've only got 100%. It's not obvious to everybody because I always quote Mark Twain, everything is common sense, but common sense is not common. Because I had a boss, and maybe you've had these bosses, who literally would say to me, Harry, I'm going to need 110% from you. And I always think to myself, what does that mean? There's only 100%. Now, I probably, like many of you, would work pretty hard, but there is only 100%. And thinking about how you spend your time versus where you would like to spend your time and what really matters. And what I actually tried to do in this process was get people to think through, if there is a difference, why is there a difference? And how big of a difference is there? And what I've realized is many people have a struggle with keeping close to what they say really is important. And here's sort of the example that I give you. This is kind of a crazy analogy. But if we're driving from Chicago to New York, and let's just say Shane and I are trying to drive together, in a crazy world, if you could really live a life balance, I think it's Route 80, the 900 miles from Chicago to New York, you'd stay on that route and you wouldn't get off it. Now, the reality of it is, you're not going to be able to do that, right? You're going to get off at an exit. You're going to get gas. You're going to get, a hamburger. You may stay at a hotel, whatever, okay? But the key is you got off, you know why you got off, and you're going to get back on. And in my mind, it's never a perfect life balance. It's really a pursuit of a life balance and really trying to minimize the surprise. So an example of that one in the real world in my mind would be one of my 3 daughters says, well, Dad, could we go for a bike ride? And I realized, well, no, I got to get on a board call. I can't. But I'm very well aware, my daughter, who's very important to me, wanted to go on a bike ride. And I'm for very good reasons, I'm saying no. Now, if the next day, all right, I'm heading off to play tennis with a couple folks, and she said, well, Dad, can we go for a bike ride? I'm going to cancel the tennis thing because, well, that's the second time she's asked me. And this is something, because I want to get back on something that, for me, is really important. So it's almost as if you're aware because you had to travel to Japan for the week. You had to get a project done. You guys were working on a big merger or something, okay? But do you know you're off? Do you know why you're off and how quickly you're going to get back on? And unfortunately, what I have seen, and I'm sure you have in many people, is the same story, but maybe a different conclusion. And the different conclusion goes like this. We're trying to drive from Chicago to New York, and I'm going with Shana, and I'm getting kind of tired, and I say, hey, Shana, can you take over for a while? Shana's driving, and all of a sudden she says, oh, Harry, I think we got a problem. So I suddenly wake up, Shana, what's the problem? Well, I wonder whether we're on the right road. What's the story? Well, there's a sign here that says entering Atlanta, Georgia. Now, I don't know the last time you drove from Chicago to New York, but if there's a sign that says entering Atlanta, we have a serious problem. Now, the real life example of that would be somebody you've worked with, which has significant issues with their partner. They don't know their children. There's all kinds of major issues. Or they've gained 50 pounds. They've got a heart attack. They've gone off the road and they've really hit the wall. And in my mind, how did that happen? I think it happened because there weren't people there who cared about you, who knew you, who would actually take the time to advise you, hey, you're not only are you not close to the road, you're off the road. And that's why when I talk about self-reflection, and I can give you some examples of ways to do this, but you better have some people that you can run this by for a reality check, because look, we can all fool ourselves. So students will sometimes say to me, Harry, you talk about this self-reflection, can you give me an example? Well, I'll give an example, but again, it's not an answer, it's an opinion, because there's an infinite number of ways to do this. Some of you may have gotten up early this morning, gone for a walk, gone for a run, or maybe taken a little time to meditate or pray. The habit I've had now, actually almost since leaving Lawrence, is I take 15 minutes. It's always at the end of the day. I'm not a morning person, 5 kids, a lot of activities like you folks. But usually for me around midnight, I take 15 minutes and I go through what I call a personal self-examination at the end of every day. Mine goes a little bit like this. What did I say I was going to do today? What did I actually do? What am I proud of? What am I not proud of? How did I lead people? How did I follow people? If I lived today over again, what would I have done differently? And then the last one is, if I have tomorrow, being fully well aware that sooner or later I won't, but if I do have tomorrow, based on what I learned today, how will I operate differently tomorrow on whatever dimension of my life has any significance, right? As a parent, as a spouse, whatever matters to you, it literally puts everything into perspective. And then students will sometimes say, well, do you do this every day? I do it every day. If I was at a party with everybody till 1 a.m, I'm going to guess most of you would probably brush your teeth before you went to bed, because that's a habit you got into. So, how do you make this actually become a habit? Then, of course, somebody will usually say, well, do you have to write it down? I don't think you have to write it down. But for me, I do, because if I don't write it down, am I self-reflecting or am I just daydreaming, particularly if I've had a couple of glasses of wine? I'm not sure what's actually happening. Okay? So that ability to put this into perspective, I think, becomes very, very important. And what I think it really does is it limits a lot of the things that we do that we really don't understand why we're doing it. And you may say, well, no, I don't know if that happens to me, but I'll give you a couple of examples that I see all the time. One example, and maybe the folks that are closer in my age have seen this, but I always find it interesting that there'll be somebody, let's say they're in their mid-40s. They've done really, really well. They've done really well, and they decided they're going to build a house. And my first thought is, well, there's a lot of houses. Do you really need to build one? Oh, no, I want to build one. Harry, it's only 6-7 months. Well, as we all know, it isn't 6 or 7 months. It's usually 2 or 3 years, and a lot goes on, and a lot of aggravation, but they finally get it done. They've been talking about it, arguing about it, but they finally got it done. What I find interesting, I run into that person 6 or 7 years later at an airport, and I'll say, hey, Roger, how you doing? Well, it's okay, but my wife and I, it's a little tough period right now. Well, Roger, why is that? Well, we're downsizing. We're downsizing. Yeah, well, all the children in the last 2 years, they've left for college, and it's a surprise that the house is too big, And what I kind of want to say is, did you not realize, let's go real slow, did you not realize that 7 years ago, that 7 years later, your children will be going to college, and you don't need a house with 6 bedrooms because it's just the 2 of you, right? I'm surprised you're surprised. And it amazes me the number of things that people do without taking the time to think about it. So this whole idea of what are you going to do and what are you not going to do? And I think this really does apply. And what I'm trying to get people to constantly do is think about where they spend their time. So a couple of examples, and then what I'll do is I'll stop and maybe we can take some questions. And I hope you folks jump in with a lot of questions because I'd really love to be, in fact, you know what I'll do? No, I'm going to stop here, Shayna. Take whatever questions you got, and then I'll continue because I really want to make sure it's more interactive here. So any questions, anything on minds of things that I've said so far?
Well, the first thing is just a shout out from Andrea Williamson from the class of 1977. So she just wants to thank you so much, and what a great topic. And then the first is from Bruce Toms. What is success, and have you found it?
Great question, Bruce. And here's the way I think about it. I decided early on, Bruce, it's not in my mind about success, it's about significance. All right. It isn't in my mind about your resume. I think it's more about your legacy and what you're leaving behind. Because I think success, and by the way, Bruce, when I say opinions, I'm very sincere about opinions because if some of these things are important to people, fine. I think it ought to be very individual. Your 168, by the way, will be a lot different than Shayna's, a lot different than mine. It's very individual. But through this self-reflection, it made things very, very simple for me. And I'll give you a good example, not right or wrong, Bruce, but when I was growing up, and I don't know if you had parents similar to this, but I distinctly remember being a young guy before I went to Lawrence, and my father saying to me one day, Harry, have you ever seen a hearse, with a coffin, with a hearse, with a coffin, going to a cemetery with a U-Haul attached to it? And I said, Dad, I'm not quite following this. He goes, well, Harry, there's a lot of people that must believe that they're either going to live forever or all this stuff that they're collecting, all right, it's going to go with them. Because if you realize you can't take this stuff with you and you're not going to live forever, what are you doing with all of this stuff, right? And so that had a big enough impact on me, Bruce, that, you know what, in fact, the flip side of that was, hey, if you do well, you work hard, and you want to get something for yourself, he'd say, Harry, fine, but Harry, never be possessed by your possessions. Never be possessed by your possessions. And some would tease me, Bruce, that I've always taken that to a little extreme because even when I was the CEO of Baxter, a $12 billion company, I've never had a car in my life other than a Toyota or a Honda because I just said to myself, I don't want to get caught up in this. Now, if somebody wants to do it, great. But in my mind, success for me was really being, could you set a good example? Could you impact other people? Again, is it really success or is it significance? So I just never think about success as being that meaningful because as you get a little older, you start to realize rather than thinking about what do other people think, maybe it's what do I think and what difference do I want to make? Maybe one last comment, Bruce. What I find very interesting is, and I'm not sure where this goes on with the students today at Lawrence, but I see an awful lot of students and they're trying to figure out what other people expect of them, right? They'll say, well, what are you doing? Well, I want to be a consultant. Well, why? Well, that's what everybody else is doing. Well, at what point in your life do you decide, what do I want to do? What do I want to do? And I think the benefit we have at Lawrence, more light, just thinking about things globally, having a strong liberal arts education, I just think for me was an enormous advantage in really taking the time to be self-reflective and thinking about this.
Well, I just want to say that Bruce is from the class of 62 and that he wants you to know that he spoke with you several years ago. He worked at Drake being Marin, one of Baxter's outplacement providers, and he attended NU's Kellogg School from 1967 to 69. So that's pretty cool.
That's great.
So Pamela has, she's very visual and she was hoping that there would be a PowerPoint slide about the 6 buckets, but could you probably just delineate those buckets or at least your buckets again?
Well, and Pamela, so I want to be helpful as well. So a couple thoughts. One is, this will help folks too. One is my Kellogg students actually set up a website that's just harrykraemer.org. And if they go to harrykraemer.org, okay, within my writings there's a listing of the buckets. I'll read them again. And then also, I know somebody else was talking about the questions. And 2 things, all the questions are listed under reflections on the website. And also, Shana, if you have a listing of all the names or the emails of the folks that are on this, I can send you an email that lists all of the questions. All right. So between the harrykraemer.org website and the emails I'll send you, I'll make sure everybody has everything. Okay.
And then from Chris, it would seem that the real balance can be more than just a percentage of time you would spend on something. For example, my spirituality might be my number one priority, but I only spend 15 minutes of time doing that. Meditation, reading a book, things like that. So what's your opinion on this? Is there enough time spent in one day, or like how do you discern priority versus percentage of time?
Yeah, no, I think it's a good point. In my mind, depending on the person, right? So I'll give you the two pieces. For some people, and I'll be respectful of everybody. Some people, the spiritual, religious doesn't matter. Now, to others of us, it's very, very important. In fact, you could almost say it impacts everything we do. It impacts every interaction, everything we do with our family, our job, how we treat people. So in my mind, some of these things overlap in a big way. Now, here's a good example that may be helpful. I'll give you the two extremes on this, because some people say, well, are there some things that I could kind of almost multitask or get like a twofer here? And I'll give you the good news and the bad news. Often when maybe bankers, when I was the CFO of Baxter, would say, hey, we'd like to take you to a Cubs game. Would you like to go some night? I'd say, well, to be honest, I don't want to spend another night away from my 5 children. Do you have children? Yeah, I've got 3 kids. I'll tell you what, does it work out that you bring 3 of your children and I'll bring 3 of mine and the 8 of us can go? And at the game, we're talking, the children are watching the baseball game, but we can talk a little bit about banking, get to know. So in that respect, I think you could really do both and get a benefit. Now, here's the other extreme. And I caution folks, particularly the younger folks, because those of us that are a little older have probably been through this, but I tried to coach one team for each of my 5 children. And I'll never forget when Susie was in the 1st grade, I was coaching 20 first grade girls in soccer, right? So I got them all in the soccer field in Evanston. And this one little girl, this little 6-year-old, she kicks the goal in. And I said, oh, hey, Ruth, your dad and mom are here. And that was great. The 6-year-old looks at me and says, well, they're not really here. I mean, they're just looking at their smartphones. I mean, they're not watching me at all, Dad. And I'm thinking to myself, wow, a 6-year-old can see that, right? So, do you ever live in the moment? Are you ever physically present? Or do you fall into this trap where we're thinking about the past and we're always planning the future, but we're not really living where we are at that point in time? And I really do find, and I think about that all the time of, are you really there? And the other day, somebody reminded me of, remember when all of us got, the first time we got those video recorders? And I can remember going to like an 8th grade or graduation, and you got 10 or 15 people, they're taking these videos, and it's like, are you really here? And I guess the thought was, oh, well, someday I'm going to watch this. I don't know, with the number of things going on, who's got time to sit down and 10 or 15 years later and watch a video when you're never really there for the beginning? So this whole idea of truly being present, I think is and I think it's a good thing to ask yourself, do you really appreciate every day you have, because you don't know how many days you do have. In fact, because one other thought on this one, because any one of these is interesting to me. There was one fellow, and this may sound a little morbid, but I don't mean it this way. Somebody said, well, how do you make sure that you live each day? And somebody said, well, can you give me an example? And this sounds a little crazy, but I'm on this call with all of you guys now. And so very sincerely, if my doctor walked into the room right now and said, Harry, I just got some bad news. I just looked at your test. Harry, you've got 3 days. Now, you can go run into the Mayo Clinic, or whatever, but you've got 3 days and that's the end of your life. How would you react? Now, my guess is the great majority of people would literally just go crazy. I mean, I got to run around. I got to do all this. I hope, and I don't know, but I hope and pray my reaction will be, well, thank you, doctor. I kind of already knew that. Is, what do you mean? Well, we've all got 3 last days, all right? And because you don't know when they're going to be, why would you live your last 3 days? How would you treat people? How would you interact any differently? So, I always think to myself, when I'm doing my self-reflection at night, hey, is there anybody that I kind of mistreated today? Is there anybody that I said something that maybe I regret. Well, you know what? Maybe I better call them. Maybe I better call them because, there may not be tomorrow. And I think and I'm an optimistic person, but just putting things into perspective. Why am I doing what I'm doing and minimizing the surprise?
So I'm going to ask you, I think, one more question, and then maybe we'll go back into more of a presentation, and then we'll ask some more questions at the end.
Well, the more, actually, you can just keep asking questions too, Gina, because the reality is most of what I like to talk about, I'd almost rather respond to things to be helpful as opposed to have a monologue. So anything that you got.
Right. So can you tell us about a time when you felt your 168 without a whack, and how did you handle it, and how did you know?
Yeah. Well, first of all, it happens all the time. I can remember early on realizing I really need to exercise. I really need to exercise. And for those of you that are in jobs that are demanding, there's this view of, well, I'll exercise when I get everything else done. And the reality is, well, you're never going to get everything else done. So you either build it into your schedule or you don't. And so early on, I realized at Baxter, I was starting to gain weight. I was tired all the time. And then somebody said, well, Harry, you know what? You keep talking about this 168. You need to build that into your schedule. And so I decided, you know what? No matter what, I will exercise an hour, 5 days a week, no matter what. And that's what I've been doing now for the last 30 years. And it's interesting. I mentioned this to one fellow a couple weeks ago, and he said, well, Harry, I can't do that, but you'll understand why. Why is that? Well, I'm traveling 50% of the time. And, by the time I get to the gym, the fitness center in the hotel closes at 9 and I can't exercise. So I'm sure you can understand. But then he said, well, Harry, I'd like to know. I said, well, you want an opinion? I'll give you an opinion. For the last 30 years, I traveled 70% of the time. When I was at Baxter, I was out of the country every other week, either in Europe, Asia, whatever. But I said, I had a little rule. And my little rule was, I have never, to this day, I never stay in a hotel that doesn't have a 24-hour gym, or ahead of time, I've worked it out with the desk clerk that he gives me the key, because sometimes I don't get there till 11 o'clock at night, because that's going to happen. Now, I was saying to this fellow, if it's not important and it doesn't matter to you, well, that's okay. But if it does matter, then don't be surprised. So this whole idea in my mind, and it's twofold, and I can give examples, Shane, if people are interested. What are the things, if you got a lot going on, what are the things you can either do less of or stop doing? And what are the things you're absolutely going to do because it's important to you, not to somebody else, but important to you?
So our next question has to do with this new book. I think I can get it without the Zoom background. Your 168. How does you see this work building on your other books?
Yeah, wow, great question. So the crazy part of it is, maybe a little story that goes with it. When I first started first left Baxter and I had the opportunity to go to Northwestern to teach, they thought I was going to do finance because, math major at Lawrence and finance at Northwestern. And I said, wait a minute, I don't have a PhD. I got an MBA. You got all these professors, finance experts. I said, I can't compete with these people. And they said, what do you want to do? And I said, you know what? I think I've got a little bit of a calling to focus on leadership, value, and ethics. The world we're living in, this was 14 years ago, I really thought we needed more value-based leaders. Now, I'm not making any political comments today, but if there was a big demand and need for value-based leaders 14 years ago, it's exponential today. That's the only political comment I'll make, okay? And so I'm into this in a big way, and now at 65, I told the dean a couple months ago, I'm down to my last 15 years, okay? I want to teach till I'm at least 80. I'm into this in a very big way. And when I think about that ability of making sure that everything I do is sort of consistent with how I spend my time, and then maybe the example that you can make. What was the part of the question, Shane?
Just how the book, latest book builds relates to the others.
No, thank you. As Julie says, I've got this great memory, but it's very short. Yeah. So here was sort of the history. So I come to Northwestern, and I'm teaching leadership, value-based leadership. And the first year I was teaching, one of the students came up to me, very, very bright fellow from India, and he said, you need to write a book. And I said, I don't even write short emails. I mean, I'm not writing a book. And he said at the end, he said, can I take your class again after the 40-hour class? And I said, are you slow? I mean, you took the class. I don't have a part two. And he said, no, I'm going to take it because if you don't write a book, I'm going to print up all the notes from your class, and then I'm going to self-publish it. Now, having 5 children, I'm used to people having a lot of enthusiasm for short periods of time. This fellow shows up all 40 hours, comes to my office, and gives me 250 double-spaced pages of an oral transcription. Now, I think the guy had been like a court reporter, okay? I mean, I didn't realize I spoke so poorly, but I thought, oh, how hard could this be? So I start literally working on this. It took me 6 weeks to do 1 chapter. So I'm averaging 2 pages a week. And I said, you know what, Julie, when I'm 80 and I'm in a home, whatever, I'll finish this thing. And I put it at my desk. The next day, this fellow, Samir Gotal, calls me. He goes, where are we with the book? And he's really pressuring me. This is a student. And I said, well, I got 1 chapter. That's all I need. That's all I need. I said, well, what are you going to do with 1 chapter? And he goes, well, you'll get mad. I said, I don't get mad. I find you intriguing. But I said, I don't get mad. He said, well, I got you an agent, and we're getting frustrated how long this process is taking. So I gave it to him. Little did I realize, 2 weeks later, I got a call from the publisher of Wiley Josie Bass, and they said, we want to do this book. I said, that's amazing. You got 1 chapter. She said, no. We've met with Samir Gotal. He's got 250 pages. He won't show them to us. And I thought, I can't even explain it. They said, well, we'll help you with this. And so that book, which was the first book from values to action, really was how, no kidding around, what do you need to do to become a value-based leader, right? And as you all know, leadership has nothing to do with titles and organizational charts. It's how can you influence people? How can you relate to people? Because if I can relate to Shana, maybe I can influence her. If I can influence her, maybe I can lead. So the first book was, how do you be a value-based leader? So I thought, I'm done. Well, 3 years later, the student said, okay, well, that's how you're a value-based leader, but how do you lead a value-based organization? How do you go from leading yourself to actually building out a global organization? And just like the first book was really based on 4 principles of leadership, the second book was what I call the 5 bests: being your best self, developing a best team, being a best partner, being a best investment, and being a best citizen. In fact, the second book, based on my math background in Lawrence, was supposed to be the 5 bests. And they said, Harry, you're way too much into numbers. No, it's not the 5 best. It's becoming the best. So the first book was how you're a value-based leader. The second book was leading a value-based organization, becoming the best. And as I said, I thought I was done until last year when the students started to say, well, okay, well, that's great, but how do you live a value-based life? So I kind of think these things flow well into one another, and these are all my classes at Northwestern at the Kellogg School. And it was kind of funny. And some of you know me well. When we talk about, in fact, I go back to the fellow who said about success. One of the things that I do in my very first class is I literally say, okay, well, what difference do you want to make? Let's talk about all the issues in the world: global poverty, global healthcare, the digital divide, environment. Well, who's going to handle these issues? We talk about this. Who's going to handle these issues? And I tease the students that there seems to be this amazing group of people called those guys. I mean, this is a gender neutral term, by the way. Some men or women that magically. And I said, no, we are those guys. I mean, you come out of Lawrence or Northwestern. I mean, if we aren't those guys, if we aren't the men or women, who is? And the fun little story I'll tell you is one of my students, literally a brilliant guy, was going to work for a bank coming out of Kellogg. But he took a church trip to Kenya, and he came back and he said, you know, and I talk about this in the book. He said, Harry, I thought about it. I'm one of those guys. I said, Andrew, what does that mean? He goes, well, Harry, do you realize that 85% of the world's poorest people are farmers? He goes, Harry, how does a farmer start? That doesn't even make any sense. And he said, Harry, if we could get these folks in Kenya better seeds, better fertilizer, basic irrigation, we could double or triple the annual crop yield on these farms. So if you want to have a little bit of fun for yourself, take a look at a website sometime. It's called the 1 Acre Fund. In fact, Shana can send it to you. It's oneacrefund.org. I brought all 5 of my children over there. Here's the deal. For those of you that were Lawrence history majors, when Kenya got its independence from the British in 1963, if you were a Kenyan citizen, you could get a 1 acre plot for your family. The problem is they couldn't raise enough produce on 1 acre to make it work. So the children die. So he went over there now, I guess it was 11, 12 years ago. Here are the statistics. He's been there 11 years. He's hired 18,000 Africans. He started in Kenya. He's been in Kenya, Rwanda, Uganda, Tanzania. They've started in Ethiopia. they've doubled or tripled the crop yield on 1.1 million farms that has so far saved the lives of 4 million children, all right? And he's not done, he's just started. And my support of the fellow is when that first book came out, From Values to Action, I call him, and by the way, in addition to looking up oneacrefund.org, there's a TED Talk, it's Andrew Youn, Y-O-U-N, and I said, you know what? You're the best example of From Values to Action. So I said, what I'm not teaching, and I'm not running around on boards now, I will do these leadership talks like I'm doing for you, and all the proceeds from the speaker fees and the books, everything goes to the One Acre Fund. And the talk I'm doing for you guys today is my 1,273rd talk in the last 8 years. I do several of these every week. And this is just a guy, by the way, he was a history major, okay? No agricultural experience, who said, you know, I'm not watching the movie, I'm in the movie. And when we talk about success versus significance, I think he's a great example of that. What else, Shana?
Awesome. Our next question. So what are the qualities in leaders that Harry has worked for that he has admired the most?
Yeah, so gives me a chance to mention what I call 4 principles. And they're the 4 principles that I believe determine whether you are or are not a value-based leader. And it's talked about in the first book, From Values to Action. And here you go. Number 1, we talked a lot about today, self-reflective. Are you somebody who actually takes the time to wonder what you're doing, what's your purpose, what matters? The second one is balance. Do you have a balanced perspective? Because as we all know, we could talk about any topic today. We could talk about the Middle East. We could talk about North Korea. We could talk about the U.S. presidential election. We won't do that. People have very strong opinions. And the people that I admire the most are people that have a balanced perspective. They take the time to understand all sides of the story, or I always quote that St. Francis comment, I seek to understand before I'm understood. So if I'm having a discussion with Shana, I will try to never say, hey, Shana, I don't know where you're coming from. No, that's sort of ignorant. If I take the time, I can understand where she's coming from, and then I'll decide, do I agree or disagree? So self-reflection, balance. I'm looking for people that have true self-confidence, not just self-confidence, but true self-confidence. They know what they know. They admit what they don't know. They admit when they're wrong. They're not trying to be right. They're trying to do the right thing. And then the fourth one is genuine humility. And by that I mean they take the time to realize, not just words, every single person matters. And it's funny, when I'm in classes sometimes, even with executives, I'll say, all right, well, how many of you really want to be leaders? And they raise their hand. How many of you think you relate to people? Raise their hand. Okay. Now this time, don't raise your hand. I don't want to embarrass you. But how many of you know the name of the receptionist when you walk in the building, and how many children she has? How many of you, when you go into the cafeteria, you know the names of the people serving you, and what their health is like and what their favorite baseball team? And when you walk down the hall and there's a maintenance person, did you ask him if he needs a ride home? Do you know who these people are? Because they are the people who make this stuff happen, okay? Sounds obvious, sounds like it's common sense, but very often people go up and they forget where they came from. And I'm looking for people who, you don't forget where you came from, you keep things in perspective, and you actually take the time to realize every single person matters. And if they fit those 4 principles, I'm going to admire them, and I'm going to try to hire them into to one of the companies that I'm on the board of. What else?
So the next is more of a statement. It's from Yasmin. She plans to take over her parents' business, but it concerns her that out of all 4 of her siblings, she's the only one interested in taking it over. She's not married yet, and has no kids, but this is a priority for her, and this business is a huge priority for her parents, which have invested their life. So maybe you could just give your opinion, as you're known to do.
Always opinion, no answers. And by the way, on the website, on the harrykraemer.org, you can always send me an email. So if any of you that have more of a personal question, I respond to every email. So more than happy to do that. I guess what I would say on this one, opinion, is 2 things. One, I'd have an open, honest discussion with your 3 siblings and find out, would one of them want to be interested? And if not, then I would literally think through who are people that I trust, that are value-based leaders, maybe somebody I went to Lawrence with, somebody I went to high school with, somebody who I now could start to develop that could help me do this, because there's no way you're going to be able to do this yourself, okay? People who would give me credit for what happened at Baxter, if I didn't have at least 15, 20 other people, there's no way it would happen. So you may want to start with your siblings, but right after that, I find at least 2 or 3 good people that could do this with you. And then again, we can talk more about it offline.
This next question is from Chris Bowers.
Ah,
Aren't there people living on the edge financially who must put 90% of their non-sleeping hours into their job or jobs? So the rest of the buckets get shorted despite being, in such a person's best intentions.
yeah. Well, hey, Chris. First of all, you're absolutely right. I'm generalizing on average what you should try to do, but we're all going to go through tough periods. In fact, Chris, it's, in the world we're living in right now, everybody cares and they'll say every day, how are you doing? And lately, Chris, for the last month or so, when people ask me, how am I doing? I say, well, how am I doing? Well, there's almost 2 million people around the world have died, more than 350,000 Americans. There's 30 million Americans that are unemployed. How am I doing? I'm actually doing pretty well. How do people, Chris, like you and I, that are blessed and more fortunate than most people, how do we help people that are a lot less worse off they're much worse off than we are? How do you deal with a single parent who's got, a first and a third grader that they can't send them to school and they're in a 1-bedroom? I mean, we could go on and on. So I think we got to figure out, Chris, as a country, how we're in the world's wealthiest country, how we help people so that they can get things more in balance. But until we get through this period, Chris, and until we have this vaccine and things get back to, never get back to normal, but some sense of the new normal, I think we got to figure out how to help these people, because you're right. They're going to be spending 100% of their time just trying to figure out how to survive.
The next is a comment with a question. So Harry, your philanthropic persona is very impressive. What a great example to donate all your speaking fees to the 1 Acre Fund. So thank you. And the question with that is, what did the student who more than encouraged you to write your first book end up doing with his life? He sounds like an amazing person.
Yeah, he is. That's Samir, and I talk about him in the first book, Samir Gothal, Gokhale. He's now involved in supply chain and strategic planning for Apple and lives in Austin, Texas. And in fact, when they asked me to do the second book, and they said, "Boy, that first book has worked out so well. You should do another book." My comment was, "Well, I can't. Samir's working for Apple. How do I get a hold of him?" They said, "Well, we'll help you. We'll help you." But he was a very good fellow. In fact, I talk to him all the time. And just like now, I'm very, very fortunate because I'm not a very tech-oriented person. So the fellow who set up the website for me, this harrykraemer.org, that has the videos and the readings and everything else, when he first set that up, one of the boards I'm on, they said, "Well, that must have cost you a fortune to set up that website." And I said, "No, Khalid Ali set it up." I said, "Well, what did you pay him?" I said, I didn't pay him anything." He said, "You should pay him." So I called Khalid and I said, "Hey, what do I owe you?" And he goes, "No, you don't owe me." He goes, "No, you do owe me. You do owe me." I said, "Whatever you tell me." He said, "I want you to start doing a blog post." And of course, this is what happens when you're 60, you're 5. I said, "What's a blog post?" He said, No, here's the deal. You send me an email every 2 weeks on a topic of leadership, of something related to that." He said, and people can follow it. I'll post the whole thing. And I said, "Okay, so all I do is I write these emails, but he puts them up on this." And of course, what happens to me is I hear people say, "Oh, Harry, I saw on Facebook or LinkedIn." I said, "I'm not on any of these things." "Oh no, you're on all of these things." So this fellow does everything. I just write emails is what I do.
That's great.
Yeah. So what else?
Our next question: how, as a society, can we inspire enough change in value-based leadership to become a more balanced society, politically, socially, economically? And is it going to be enough given our current situation and the pandemic?
Yeah. So you know what? I get very emotional about Lawrence because Lawrence had like many of us, had such an enormous impact on me. And I can remember the first week being there, where one of the deans said that, we're here, and the primary thing here is not so much your first job as gaining the ability to educate yourself the rest of your life. And the whole more light, and thinking about the world and so on. And my opinion, that's why I say opinion, is what's happened now, and I'd be curious whether folks agree with this because it's an opinion, is that this whole idea of take the time to understand all sides of the story. So I'll be specific. When I read the New York Times every day, I'm not going to read that without reading the Wall Street Journal, and the Financial Times and the Economist summaries, so I get a balanced view, okay? But, if you only understand one side of the story, no wonder we've got all these problems. And I think this goes back to the fact that with social media now, as you folks know, if you happen to go on the right side of things and you're right wing, whatever, you've got your own television stations, you've got your own, social, media things, whatever, and you're there. Then you got somebody on the left side, and I'm not even taking, I don't really care what side you're on, but everything is on the left side. And what I've realized is that I've heard this term now, I guess it's called echo chambers. All you hear is what you want to hear. And the number of people that have absolutely no understanding of the other perspective. Because if you think about it, okay, we can talk about anything. And by the way, in class, I talk about everything. What do you want to talk about? You want to talk about immigration? You want to talk about gun control? Almost every single one of these things, if it's one extreme or the other, no wonder we don't get anything done. So what do I think we need to do? I think we need to get more people studying liberal arts. I think we need to get more people that take the time to reduce the number of times they say, oh, I don't understand. I don't understand, okay? Now, there's a lot of things that go on that you say, well, boy, I wouldn't do that. I wouldn't think that. But you better take the time to understand why do they believe that, or there's no way you're going to be able to convince somebody of anything differently, all right? I mean, and I would say now we've gotten this thing so polarized, it's incredible, all right? And again, regardless of your political affiliations or whatever, I do have to say, and maybe this is a little political comment, but I do find it remarkable, okay, that in 5 days, Biden is going to be inaugurated, all right? I find it interesting that the Economist is telling me 70% of Republicans, all right? And remember, Republicans is half the population. So 70% of 50%, I think that's 35%. When this guy gets inaugurated, more than 1/3 of Americans do not believe he legally got elected. And this guy's supposed to be president? I mean, we're living through interesting times. And I try not to take a side one way or another, but I will tell you, it's pretty remarkable if you're a global person, and I'm getting calls from, friends of mine that I work with in Baxter in Mexico, and friends calling me saying, I'm looking at these pictures of what's happening in what? Is this the United States of America? I mean, what are you guys doing? I don't have a real good answer. I mean, we're living an interesting period here. And I do believe unless we find a way to get people to understand multiple perspectives, this is a bad road we're going down, a very bad. And I'm an optimist, but this is not a good situation for anybody.
Our next is a comment, and this is from Anne. I would like to have enjoyed working with you as a leader with such a refreshing mindset. It would have been motivating, and it would have taught me so much about great leadership. So I agree. I think it would have been amazing working for you. So the next question is from Lauren, and this is a fantastic question. She's a 2012 alum that has been focused on the wrong buckets for the last 10 years. She's been focusing on money and things more than her art or creating, which is her true passion. And she's wondering if it's too late to shift buckets, or how do you avoid slipping into despair at your past mistakes and realign for your future?
Yeah. So let me tell you this. If you're a 2012 graduate, you got a lot of time, okay? In fact, my son, Andrew, graduated in 2013. So I would still consider you very young. And what I would say is and by the way, I give you a lot of credit because, and I'm very sincere when I say this, I could get very emotional about this. I give you a lot of credit. You figured it out at 30. You figured out that maybe money isn't the answer to everything. Maybe it isn't just what I have. And I got to tell you, I've seen people, they're 60 and they haven't figured that out, okay? Or they're 60 and they're starting to figure it out and they're saying, you know what? I kind of figured this out kind of late. So the reason why I do this in teaching in school is I think the earlier you can do this, the earlier you can do, and you've got plenty of time, all right? And every day's a learning experience. Leadership is a journey. So now that you figured it out, taking the time and sit down with your friends and decide how do you want to change the buckets, but you got plenty of time, no issue at all. What's next, Shane?
Well, so we've actually finished all the questions that are in the chat and in that have been sent. So I guess I have one, and I want you to elaborate more on the art of being planful, right? So you talk about that in the chapter 5 of your book. So how much time do you dedicate to planning, and how are you able to be flexible with your planning?
Yeah, this one's kind of fun, Shana, because again, let's be open. Other people, when they first read the book or they first hear about it, they'll say, well, I don't know, this planning thing, I like a little spontaneity here. I mean, let's pretend we're back in Lawrence. And I actually use a Lawrence example on this, and because most people don't believe this, but the more, and somebody could challenge this, but the more planful you are, the more freedom you do have, and the more spontaneity. Here's the example I'll give you. I won't mention names, but one of my roommates at Lawrence, I can remember we'd have like a 2-week term paper to do, okay? And, I would try to work on a little bit every day, whatever. And this fellow, super good guy, he waited till the last night. He shows up from the library with like 30 books, pack of cigarettes, and a cup of coffee, and it's like, it's going to be an all-nighter, right? Now, if that night I came up to him and said, hey, you know what, there's a new movie, we can do this. Well, they can't do anything because they have no degrees of freedom. But see, the more planful you are, the more degrees of freedom you have. And by the way, when I do these talks, I sometimes mention to Shana, nobody's taken me up on this, but I'll make this offer to everybody here today. One of these characters, I've got my calendar day by day pretty well planned for the next 6 to 9 months. I kind of know what I'm going to do. Planful. Now, however, if anybody on this call, sometime in the next week or two, Shana, calls me or sends me an email, says, hey, I've got 2 extra tickets for Bruce Springsteen in Portland, Oregon, I'll be there. I mean, I will adjust, okay? So being planful does not mean that you don't have degrees of freedom. In fact, I would argue the more planful you are, the more degrees of freedom that you do have, all right? That's the best way I could sort of describe it, all right?
So we're at a time boundary. Did you have any last thoughts or comments that you want to share with everybody before we conclude? Hello?
Who's?
Oh, sorry. We're at a time boundary. So do you have, do we have any last things that you want to share with?
Well, the last comment I make is it's fantastic to just be with all of you. And I really do hope and pray that you and your families are well. Feel free anytime to either shoot me an email or on that website. I respond to everything. And I really wish the best of everybody and hope to see everybody at some time up at Lawrence. And Shana, enjoy doing it and happy